Good evening and welcome, members and guardians, to the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum. My name is Helen Turner, and I'm honored to serve as the museum's Director of Education. Regrettably, our Executive Director, Myron Friedman, was unable to attend tonight's program. However, he has the perfect excuse. He is meeting his first grandchild. Yeah, we can give a nice round of applause. But in his absence, he extends a warm welcome to all of you and a deep felt thanks for your commitment to the museum. Therefore, the honor has fallen to me to introduce tonight's wonderful speakers. This program would not have happened without the museum's Director of Marketing Communications, Amy Lutz. As many of you know, Amy is a passionate historian, educator, and advocate. Amy's scholarship focuses on media literacy, the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, and the focus of tonight's program, Swiss diplomat and Holocaust rescuer Karl Lutz. Her professional and scholarly contributions have garnered admiration from peers and audiences alike, and she has a unique ability to connect historical narratives to present-day lessons, making her an invaluable voice in the effort to combat misinformation and foster understanding. Amy is a board member of the Karl Lutz Society, and her role was integral in the donation of this artifact to the museum. Tonight's program, American Album, delves into the rich tapestry of Karl Lutz's life, his resilience, courage, and humanity. Amy's insight and storytelling will guide us through this journey, reminding us of the power of memory to inspire action and encourage hope. So please join me in welcoming Amy Lutz.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yeah. I think it's working. You know, I'm not used to being the one down here, but thank you all for coming here tonight. I want to start before we introduce our illustrious speaker tonight and jump into our presentation. I actually want to thank a couple other people. As many of you know, those of you who are volunteers and members know that we have a really incredible team here at the Holocaust Museum. And although this is my passion, it would not have happened without a few individuals in this room. So to start, all right, where's Amy Moorman? I found her. So Amy Moorman is the Director of Archives and Collections. Amy was kind of the co-project lead on this. She actually went to Chicago to meet Jörg, our featured speaker, to actually pick it up. So Amy's impact in this is very appreciated. Rob, hi Rob. Rob Nelson is our exhibitions coordinator. He is the one who actually put together the pop-up out there and also the special exhibition downstairs, if you all have not visited. And then finally, Shannon Hess, who is hiding. Shannon Hess, who is our digital archives assistant. She was the one responsible for digitizing all of the material you'll see tonight, and so that really makes it accessible. So can you all give them a round of applause, please? All right, so let's get started. So many of you, my friend Jerry there, for example, have heard this Karl Lutz story from me before, but what I'm hoping is tonight will lay out through this beautiful artifact some really interesting details. But to start, I want to introduce our featured speaker tonight, Deputy Consul Jörg Oberschmidt. You are the Deputy Consul General and Senior Public Diplomacy Officer for the Swiss Consulate in Chicago. So tell us a little bit more about what that means, what you do for a living.
Yes, thank you for having me. We are a consulate general in Chicago with covering 11 Midwestern states, including Missouri. And we are not a traditional consulate. We don't do passports or visa. We're more of a diplomatic mission. What we do is government relations, trade, public diplomacy, culture, and science. And as part of my duties, I also write a history blog. And this is how I came to connect with Karl Lutz. I was given a booklet about his life and learned that he spent some time here in the Midwest. So I wrote a blog about his life here in the Midwest. If you're interested to read it, it's on the Swiss Impact website that the embassy runs, where all the events that Swiss consulates do in the United States are featured.
Excellent. And that's a great transition to my next question. You know, obviously, you've been connected to this story of Karl Lutz through your work, through the history blog, which was sent to me by the Karl Lutz Society, which is how I found out about it. So as we're jumping into tonight's speech, and many of you saw some of the history and the artifact today, can you remind me what brought you to this story about Karl Lutz and give us a little bit overview of his time here in the Midwest?
So when I learned that he spent some time in the Midwest, I dove a little bit deeper into his life. He was born in 1895 in eastern Switzerland, a town called Walzenhausen, second child of 10 children that his mother Ursula and his father Johannes had. His father died relatively at a young age. I think he was, remember how old he was when his father died, but he was very young. And he then relied on his mother, who raised the 10 children. Ursula Lutz was a Sunday school teacher and raising 10 children on the side as well. So great job on her part. And Carl then ended up doing an apprenticeship in nearby St. Margrethen, and also took some English courses in Rheineck. And then through a family friend who happened to be in Granite City, he had the opportunity to come here to the United States at age 18.
And we'll dive a little bit into that story about him coming to America. This photo right here, we actually don't have it on display, but we have a copy of this. This, of course, is a young Carl Lutz right in front of the Statue of Liberty. We'll dive into this a little bit later, but Carl was also an avid photographer, and so we'll jump into that. But you know, many of you who don't know Carl Lutz's story, you might be wondering, well, what did he do during the Holocaust? We will get to that. But I promise, as those of you who've heard me tell this story before, you know that each aspect of his life builds on each other to get to this beautiful story in the end. So to start that, we're actually going to dive into some of these artifacts, some of the ones you've actually seen on display. And you know, one thing we talked about before this presentation is, I mean, how many of us have a passport, have travel documents, and they seem so simple. They seem so perfunctory. They seem like something we have all the time. But through, as you'll see in the next few slides, these very simple documents tell a very beautiful story. So we're going to start with this one. Jörg, tell me what's happening in this image right here.
So here we see a passage that Carl's taking at age 18. He's still spelling his name the Germanic way with a K. And he's traveling third class on a ship called the Imperator. And Imperator was a brand new ship in 1913. It was the largest ship of its kind at the time, 4,000 passengers, 1,200 crew members. And after World War I, the United States Navy used it as a troop transport. Before then, it went to the Cunard Line.
Mm-hmm. And my understanding is the Imperator.
Imperator.
See, as a Midwesterner, I say Imperator. I'm from Kansas, so forgive me. But this ship was part of the White Star Line, and this is going to be the first part of audience participation of the night. There's a very famous ship that was part of the White Star Line. Can someone tell me what that was? That was the Titanic, which will come back in this story, I promise. We have another Titanic reference.
Interesting also to see that there were between 2 and 8 beds per cabin. Carl being in third class, I don't think he had only 2 beds in this cabin.
There were 8 beds, but there were 5 meals, I think. You get about 5 meals
and you
a
could,
day.
Point number 2 at the bottom there, you could have up to 5 meals a day.
Absolutely, which sounds pretty good to me. So again, you hinted at this. I just want to put some times here on us so we can plot this on the map. So you had mentioned, of course, he comes in 1913. He ends up in Granite City. We're going to talk a little bit more about Granite City through the documents. He ends up in Warrenton, Missouri for a short period of time in college, Washington, D.C., and then is in a variety of diplomatic appointments, including the final one in downtown St. Louis, which we will chat about first. So chat about a little bit later. But so Carl Lutz was a Swiss diplomat, again, living in St. Louis. And many of you in the audience might be thinking, there's no Swiss consulate in St. Louis. What are you talking about? So Jörg, can you tell us, was there ever a Swiss consulate here, and when did it close?
There was. In fact, it opened in 1851. Mind you, Chicago was the first official consulate that opened in Chicago was the Swiss consulate in 1864. So St. Louis had a consulate in 1851. And it was a full consulate until mid-1930s. Then it became an honorary consulate until 1994. It closed at that point. We then had a honorary consulate in Kansas City, but that is no longer either. And the reasons for that is just the need, how big the Swiss community is, if there are needs in terms of trade, what have you.
And so now your office covers this entire territory.
So now
including St.
Missouri
Louis.
is part of our entire 11-state region.
Absolutely. So as someone who works in consulate work like yourself, we'll get a little bit more into Carl Lutz's time in St. Louis, but he spent, as you can see, a few different appointments as a diplomat representing Switzerland here in the United States. What kind of work would he have done in that position?
So he was working in the Chancery, and what they do is registrations of marriages, births, deaths, issuing passport, stuff like that.
We'll talk about this a little later, but Carl Lutz has this role as a connector, and you see it here in this role, but then we'll later see it during his rescue work as well. So now we're going to dive into a few more documents. Again, some of whom you may have seen in that case out there and thought, what in the world is this? So we're going to talk about them. So Carl Lutz was not the only member of his family to come here to the United States. I'm actually going to go back to an earlier question, but he was a member of a German-speaking family coming from Switzerland. He comes, as you said, in 1913, and then is followed by his family. Why would someone like Carl Lutz come at the age of 18, probably knowing very little English, to somewhere like the United States?
So in his case, in a later CV, he wrote that he wanted to experience the land of unlimited opportunities for himself. And he had this opportunity to come here, and to this day, people come here to the land of unlimited opportunity.
And he took advantage of it. We'll see a little later some of the things he did while he was here in the United States. But again, we'll talk about it. So members of his family joined him here in the United States. We have a couple passports, actually, in this collection, in this archive. Who are these people on the screen right now?
So we see here on the left side is the passport of his mother, Ursula. And it's very interesting, the descriptions that they give. Besides her height, which is 5'3", so 163 centimeters, is 5'3". But then it says she's slim, she has brown hair, she has a regular forehead, small eyebrows, brown eyes, a small nose, and proportional mouth and chin.
And so they would have done that at the time, right? Because they didn't have fingerprints or biometrics. That's
Correct.
how they identified people. And then who's this one on the other side?
And then on the other side is his brother, Walter, who's then later on became a U.S. citizen. That's an American passport from those days.
And so speaking of Walter, this is another document. We have some of his immigration papers. Talk to us what we learned from this document right here.
So very interesting. Walter came in the middle of World War I, 1916. And he sailed on a ship called the Norrendam. And the Norrendam was actually the first ship reporting the icebergs that later on sank the Titanic. And interesting here is, excuse me, it states there that his earnings are $28 a week. And that will be equivalent of $42,000 in today's money.
And he came in the middle of World War I, which in and of itself is wild. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but we all lived through a pandemic just a few years ago. Traveling during a pandemic, let alone a war, could be insane. Just so anyone knows, Walter came and joined his brother Carl a few years later. I did look up the address that they lived at in Granite City. I don't think the home is there anymore, but they did live there together for a time. Now, this document that's on the screen right now goes back to our discussion about the Swiss consulate. Some of you may have seen this in the case. We can read almost none of this writing. But based upon your work on this, tell us what's happening right here.
So what we see here is a letter of support written by Carl Lutz on the consulate stationery and notarized by the Swiss consulate in 1918. And he's stating that he lives in Granite City, and that he would like to have his mother, the widow Ursula Lutz, 69 years old, living in Rheineck, Canton St. Gallen, come to the United States, live with him so that he can take care of her.
This is such a sweet story here, and it continues on this next slide. These are two of my favorite documents for reasons I'll talk about, but we see Ursula here, but there's another woman. What's happening in these two documents here?
So on the left, we do see Ursula again, and on the right is Carl's older sister, Emma, who came here to work in his household, be his housekeeper.
And we know that because they included on the top that Emma came to serve in his house. And what I love about this one is that Ursula came and they asked the period, and she said ever, that she's coming to live with her sons, Walter and Carl, forever. So the family rejoined here or at least a portion of the family rejoined here in the United States. And then here's another one. This is for his sister Emma, correct? What's happening in this document? We learned some interesting things from this one.
So one of the things that sticks out is that Emma, the question there is, have you lived elsewhere besides your hometown? And it says that she spent a year in La Chaux-de-Fonds. And this has been, and is, to this day continues to be a common practice for young Swiss kids to spend a year in the French-speaking part to learn French. Switzerland has 4 official languages, so you're forced to pick up 1 or 2 of the other national languages. And so it's a popular thing is to go to the French part of Switzerland and learn French.
So very clearly she spent some time there. Excellent. It's interesting living in the United States. I, of course, learned French myself, but it was because I had to take it during high school. It was a little bit different. I think we have one more document. Again, this is for the two ladies. What's happening right here?
So they booked a passage in France, and this is in 1918. This is right during World War I. So they had to travel from Switzerland through France to Bordeaux, and in Bordeaux is where they boarded the ship. Keep in mind also 1918 is in the middle of the Spanish flu. Not only are they going through the war, but also through the Spanish flu.
So what we're seeing here is, of course, Carl Lutz comes as a young man by himself, maybe knowing a little English, but then he's joined by his family who wanted to come to this so-called land of opportunity to join together so badly that they came during a war and a pandemic.
Yeah.
And just the courage of that, the courage of not knowing if you're going to make it, not knowing who you're going to meet when you go there, but how important it was for them to be together.
I guess if you raise 10 children, nothing else phases you.
Which I think is probably fair. Well, and only 3 of them were here, so I think the rest of them were a little bit older. So it's just this beautiful story we found through these documents here. So now that the family is in America, this is where we are in the time period. I had mentioned earlier that Carl Lutz was a bit of a photographer himself, and in fact, for our historians in the room, if you're doing any research on kind of the post-liberation Budapest in 1945 and you're looking through archives, you're actually going to run into photos taken by Carl Lutz that are utilized for research purposes. And so one of the things that we had talked about, and we'll talk about these photos here in a second, is, I don't mean to date myself here, but if I'm going on a trip, we went to Europe a couple summers ago, I'm pulling out my phone, I have my Instagram page, I'm taking photos all over the place. Well, Carl Lutz did something similar. He brought a camera with him. And so I think these photos tell a million stories. These are photos of him as a young person in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York. You see him in Philadelphia over here. These 2 photos are the ones that we chatted about. Number 1, I think this photo of Wilson tells 1,000 stories, and we don't know any of them, but you see Wilson, who's a little older, for one, he's a little enfeebled. He's being clearly kind of pulled back in by this man of color who probably works in the White House. But I also noticed how close Carl Lutz was able to get this kind of photo. And then what's happening in this middle one right here? You told me this earlier.
That's the inauguration of Calvin Coolidge.
The inauguration of Calvin Coolidge. So this young man who was born in a devout Methodist family and a small town in Switzerland is now seeing presidents, is now in D.C. So I can imagine that was a pretty dramatic change from one place to another.
Well, everything is big in America, and you can see with the inauguration. We don't have inaugurations like that in Switzerland.
Absolutely. So I'm sure that was, and especially as a young man, he's probably in his 20s for many of that. All right, this is the second audience participation moment of the night. My friends in the room, where was this photo taken? Thank you very much. So this is a photo that was taken in 1934 in front of the World's Fair Pavilion, I believe. This is Carl Lutz, and this is his wife, Gertrude, who he met here in St. Louis, and we'll talk a little bit about her in a second. This is a photo that was kind of gifted to us from the Carl Lutz Society. And so, remember we talked about the timeline earlier? Carl Lutz is the Swiss diplomat, and its final appointment is in downtown St. Louis from 1933 to 1934. There was this great article in the Post-Dispatch. This is their wedding announcement. They met here. They worked in the same building. And I'm curious if anyone else knows. So it gives the address somewhere in here. 3730. Does anyone know where that is? I do, but it's on SLU's campus. It's now Queen's Daughters Hall, which I don't know what SLU does with it now, but she lived there in some sort of rooming house. But Carl Lutz met his wife Gertrude Fankhauser here. She becomes part of the rescue effort. We'll talk about that later. But what did she do with the rest of her life?
She's at the consulate, and she's working at the consulate in 1934 when he came here to work in the Chancery. Mm-hmm. But she, to be mentioned...
Yeah, you want to talk about her post-war career as well.
So she was very helpful to him in Palestine as well as in Budapest. Mm-hmm. But after the war, she had a great career. She rose to be vice president for UNICEF. She also worked for UNICEF in Poland and in Brazil. So she had a diplomatic career in her own right after the war.
Absolutely, and just so those of you who know, our museum runs the Lutz Humanitarian Award. One of the reasons we did not call it the Carl Lutz Award was because we wanted to recognize every single person that was part of that rescue effort, including Gertrude, who was recognized for that. Just so you all know, I found out in this article, this is a bit separate. If you all want to know where he lived, does anyone know where the old Statler Hotel was? It's now the Marriott Grand in Washington. He lived there when he worked here for at least a period of time. So we're going to leave his time here in St. Louis. I know you cannot read this. This is not a newspaper that is meant to be read. This is the problem, I'm sure, as our archivist can tell you. Digitizing old newspapers is usually not super fun. But I like to bring this up for a couple of reasons. We'll talk about Carl Lutz's time just in a moment in Mandatory Palestine, which was a territory under the British Mandate. We know the State of Israel was not founded until 1948. But before we get to that, this is an article that was posted in the St. Louis Star and Times in 1936, in May of 1936. And what I love about it is it's almost a full-page article. It talks about former St. Louisans in a biblical setting. And there's multiple things in this piece that indicate that Carl Lutz, or at least St. Louis, considered Carl Lutz a St. Louisan. And those of us who live here know that there's such a pride in living here. He visited his friends in Warrenton, he sent newspapers back, and I bring this up because I think it has a very interesting transition to what we're going to talk about. This author, who had no idea what Carl Lutz was going to do with his life in 1936, wrote this very interesting paragraph in which he says, "It's a big move from the Mississippi to the Jordan. In the consular service, one never knows where he may be sent next." You will find out where he was sent next because we live in 2024. But let's talk a little bit about this. So Carl Lutz, he gets married in Switzerland in 1935, and his next diplomatic appointment is in the British Mandate of Palestine, which is a much larger territory. Israel, the Gaza Strip, I think Lebanon was part of the Mandate as well at the time. And he's there for the first few years, 1936, and then 1939 something happens, the war breaks out. And he is now in a British Mandate, and there are a number of Germans stuck in this British mandatory territory. And this is where a neutral diplomat like Carl Lutz would come in. So in a case like this, what did Carl Lutz do with that in his role in British Palestine at the time?
So Lutz was there also representing German interests. So what happens is that during the war, Switzerland had over 200 protective mandates in 35 countries. So when the war broke out, Germany asked that Switzerland represent its interests in Palestine. So what did that mean? So there were 2,500 German citizens. They were interned by the British, but there were also 70,000 German Jews. They were Jews, but they were German citizens. In addition to that, there were a lot of assets that had to be managed. In one of his writings, he points out that in 2 months, he drove 10,000 kilometers, so about 6,000 miles, plus he met over 3,500 people. This all in 2 months. So he was extremely busy carrying out this mandate. However, he had a very, very good reputation in Berlin for the job that he did. And this connection helped him later on in his next assignment.
Yeah,
as
this
we will learn.
becomes very important later. And we're skipping ahead a little bit, but we talked about it because I think the audience might be interested. He has some connection with this area after the war, too. What was that?
Yes, so after he left Budapest, he took a leave, and then he was promoted to consul in the German interest section in Zurich. And that was previously was the consulate general, but then after the war, as Germany was being rebuilt and was occupied, he was the German interest section. And he was then asked if he could, on behalf of the evangelical German mission, help negotiate with the Israelis all these assets that were left in Palestine that the evangelical mission ran. These were orphanages, hospitals, homes for the blind, girls' schools, churches. All these assets had to be managed. Mm-hmm. And so he was given this mandate. So he ran that German interest section for 6 years. And he spent 1 year negotiating with the Israelis all these assets of the German evangelical mission.
So we find out, I promise you, we're not just talking about this because I have this fun article. It's because these things all connect. His history all connects. So we're finally going to get to Budapest, everyone. I promised we would get here. So just some context. Thank you so much. Great. Thank you. This sign will become important. Don't worry. Thank you, Kelsey. So Karl Lutz does take a leave of absence after his time in Palestine, we believe, because it's when his mother passed away. We believe she came back to Switzerland when he left to the United States.
She passed away in 1941.
1941.
And then he, because of the war in the Balkans, he could not travel back to Palestine anymore. So he was assigned to Berlin to represent the interests of Yugoslavia. And that, again, gave him a direct contact with the German authorities, which helped him later on.
He starts to build this positive reputation as this good German-speaking diplomat from Switzerland. So Karl Lutz ends up in Budapest in 1942. Those of you, we have museum educators in this room, historians, you'll probably know that Hungary was allied with the Axis powers, but Germany did not occupy Hungary until March 19th of 1944, which is very important here because the bulk of the rescue effort does not begin until 1944. So the German Wehrmacht invades, really led by Adolf Eichmann. They come March 19th, 1944. Within a couple months, by mid-May, the deportations to Auschwitz began in the rural areas of Hungary. Between mid-May and early July of 1944, about 440,000 Hungarian Jews are sent to Auschwitz. Most are killed upon arrival. And this is the environment in which Karl Lutz is working. He's obviously had a little bit of experience in Palestine during a wartime of sorts, but this is a different experience. Karl Lutz is now a diplomat. Yeah, go ahead.
Because of his experience in Palestine, he was selected for Budapest because they needed somebody that was very experienced, and he was the person. Now, he agreed to go because he figured he'd only be there like 2-3 months.
That does not happen. And let's be thankful that that's not what happens, because if he'd been only there a couple months, we might not be here talking about this. So Karl Lutz is in Budapest. We're 1944. The Wehrmacht has arrived. Now, what would Karl Lutz have done in that position as a neutral diplomat? He received a promotion, I believe, to vice consul. What was his role during wartime?
So Switzerland represented the interests of 12 countries in Hungary, including the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom is of particular interest because it led to later on the Schutzbrief. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, which we will talk about in just a second. Now, thank you, Kelsey, for bringing the sign that I forgot to bring. So this is an official copy of the sign outside the Swiss legation, which we'll talk about in a second, that was donated by Agnes Hershey-Grauss, who, of course, is Karl Lutz's stepdaughter. And I bring this up, and you can all come see it later if you can't see it from there, because I actually think this artifact tells a story. It's a copy, but it tells a story. What's happening here, Jörg? What is this?
So this is a nice average day in Budapest as you're dodging bullets. And I think we cannot underestimate the danger that these people were in. He writes in a later internal letter that he himself barely escaped being shot by a Soviet officer, and that two of his colleagues, including the chargé d'affaires, were arrested by the Soviets and hauled off to Moscow. They were hauled off together with Raoul Wallenberg. Mm-hmm. And whereas the Swiss diplomats, a year later, in exchange for two Soviet pilots, were released, tragically, Raoul Wallenberg never left Moscow.
And many of you know Wallenberg as being a Swedish diplomat. He was funded by the U.S. War Refugee Board, did rescue people. He met Carl Lutz, was one of the first people he met in 1944. But you're right, there's literal bullet holes on this once the Red Army arrived, and I can imagine it was a terrifying experience. Now, you had mentioned the Schutzpasses, or protective papers is sometimes what we call them. We have a copy of one here that is in the artifact. So Carl Lutz is known as a man who kind of defied the Nazis with paperwork. Sounds very simple. What does that mean? What is this document, and what did it mean to the Jews of Budapest?
So really, it's only a piece of paper. Unless you have the authority behind it, it's not really worth anything. However, Switzerland as a protective power had that authority, and Carl Lutz, thanks to his good relations with the German authorities, was respected, and that issuing these would also be honored. And so he writes in one of his papers that they were granted, because of the mandate for the British Palestine, they were going to have a number of Jews emigrate to Palestine, and then these letters would be used for that.
Supposedly.
So at the time, the number 5,000 was raised. And he looked at this and he said, well, they did the first 5,000 letters in one night and they were gone the next day. So he said, the Germans said 5,000 Einheiten. In German, an Einheit is a unit, but it means it's something indivisible. So he interpreted that a unit means a family, up to 10, 20, whatever. And so he authorized another 45,000 letters immediately. And he did that, obviously, with the knowledge of the Swiss government. He could not have done this just on his own. He needed the authority to do that.
Absolutely, and he actually, he speaks with Adolf Eichmann about this at one point, who is part of the subject of our exhibition downstairs. And we talked about this, I wonder if we could dive a little bit into this. We talked about this a little bit before. So Carl Lutz goes to talk to Adolf Eichmann, who's hanging out in his hotel in Budapest, talks to him about these papers, getting them authorized, the ones that you just mentioned. And Eichmann takes the opportunity to make fun of him. He says, "Who do you think you are, Moses taking your people to the promised land?" But Eichmann doesn't want to make the decision. And so what I'm hearing you say is that the decision is kicked up to the Führer's office, who knew Carl Lutz from his work.
Correct.
And approved of this in part because of his previous work in British Palestine.
In some later films, he talks about this, and he says that, Eichmann and Himmler were totally against this, and they were not going to allow it. But he was kicked up into the Führer Hauptquartier, and he said 3-4 days later, the orders came back, and apparently Hitler said that this man did a good job for us in Palestine. If this is his wish, let him have it. And so Hitler overruled Himmler and Eichmann, and they just let it go.
Without fully realizing that they were then permitting the rescue of tens of thousands of people, which is just, I learned so much about diplomacy through this story, just the skill in having to negotiate, knowing who you need to know, and in Carl Lutz's experience, just having a good reputation, working hard was really what got him here. Let's talk about this. Can you tell me, as I am not a German or Hungarian speaker, can you tell me what is on this Schutzpass we have on the screen?
So I can tell you the German part. I don't know what it says in Hungarian. But on the German side, it says the Swiss Embassy Foreign Interest Section hereby certifies that, the name of the person, is registered for emigration and is therefore considered to have a valid passport. So it's just a letter of passage that grants the holder that they have free passage.
And what that really meant was they weren't actually going to Palestine at the time because there was no way to get out. But what it meant is that anyone holding these papers could not be deported. They were usually exempt from the ghettoization in Hungary. Karl Lutz's wife Gertrude is an important part of this. They set up protective houses, about 76 of them in Budapest, where they housed Jewish people. I think about 3,000 people total who had lost their homes, lost their property. And so in a very short period of time, I mean, most of this rescue effort takes place in the last half of the year, between October and December. There are tens of thousands of protective papers flying around. There's homes. Karl Lutz is jumping in some cases to rescue individual people. There's a very famous story you may be familiar with. Those of us who went to Europe a couple summers ago, we saw the shoes on the banks of the Danube, that memorial. For those of you who don't know, that's a memorial in Budapest. There are these, I think, bronze shoes on the bank, and the reason those were there is because the Arrow Cross, the government who staged a coup over the Hungarian government in October 1944, they were responsible for the murder of about 60,000 Jews on their own. Very collaborationist, but they would take groups of Jews down to the Danube, shoot them and push them in the water and kill large amounts of people. And at one point, Karl Lutz had been driving by, and this had just happened, and this woman was jumping up and down in the water saying, "Mr. Lutz, Mr. Lutz, Mr. Lutz." He sees her. I believe she'd been shot, but the water was so cold that slowed the blood. He pulls her out in front of these young men with guns and starts yelling at them about he's the vice consul, this is a woman who has protection, and he takes her away. He takes her back, gets her a surgeon, and she ends up surviving the war. We know that story because she told that story. And so Karl Lutz, has this paperwork, and we talked about this. There was also forgeries running around. He knew about the forgeries, but as long as they were protecting people, it did not matter. But he also jumped in and saved individual people.
He says in 1945, as he was recalled to Switzerland, the trip took 5 days just to get to the Bulgarian-Turkish border. And at that border, they were held up, and they were risking being deported to Russia. So he called the ambassador in Ankara, the Swiss ambassador, who then cleared things up so that they could then go through Istanbul and then take a ship. And so then he was able to get back to Switzerland. But even for diplomats in those days, it was very, very difficult. It was very, very dangerous traveling. Also in one of his writings, he points out that the Soviets bombed Budapest for several weeks, 7 hours a day. And they were in the then British embassy in the cellar as they were waiting for the whole thing to stop.
Yeah, exactly. And so, it brings us back to this sign that there's bullet holes, there's damage from the Soviet army. It is a great transition to there's these papers flying around, people are being rescued, but the war is almost over. The Red Army shows up on Christmas Eve, 1944, and they end up taking refuge. Karl Lutz and his staff and his wife take refuge in the basement of the British embassy.
Plus the Swedish minister and 50 staff members of the Swedish legation as well.
Tight basement. But as you mentioned, I want to kind of connect us together before we wrap up here in a second. There's just so much courage in this story. And I think the artifacts tell us that. We see the courage of his family coming to the United States during war, during a pandemic, and then we see the courage of this diplomat trying to get home in some cases, but doing what he's doing under the threat of death, under the threat of bombing. So the war is towards the end. They get liberated. You talked about him going home. Very briefly, you touched on it. What does Karl Lutz do after the war? What are his final kind of appointments?
So after he came back, he took a break, and then, as I mentioned, he was promoted to consul. He took over the German interest section in Zurich. He negotiated for the German Evangelical Mission in Palestine. Later on, he expressed his desire that he wanted to be appointed somewhere in southern Germany or in Austria. He wanted to be closer to home. That wish was granted. He was then appointed consul in Bregenz, which is right across the Rhine River in Austria. And that was his last posting as consul general there before he retired.
He retires. He ends up passing away in 1975. He and his wife are both named Righteous Among the Nations in Yad Vashem. He was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize 3 times, never winning. And for many people, some of you have heard this story, probably from me, or probably from this museum, but for many people, his story has kind of been lost to history. Not enough people know this story. So let's kind of bring us back. We talked about Carl Lutz coming to America. Let's talk about him coming back to America through this artifact. So this artifact, many of you saw. I know, Amy, you had the big binder as well. When were you first informed of the existence of this artifact, and how was the Swiss Embassy and consulate involved in this process?
So I was contacted by a colleague of mine, a young diplomat who is now at the embassy in Washington. And he's a member of the Karl Lutz Society. And he was at a meeting in Switzerland where also Agnes Hirschi was. And that's when he learned about these artifacts. So he wrote to me, he told me he read my blog. Agnes Hirschi also read the blog. And so he said, how can we get these artifacts to St. Louis? So he brought them over. And it just happened that my boss, Consul General, was in Washington at that time, so he handed over to my boss, who put it in his suitcase, and then Amy came up to our consulate in Chicago, and we were able to hand it over to her. Not before we took a really close look at some of these items, and actually I learned a lot about them coming here. I did a little bit of additional research, some of his writings, dive a little bit deeper into those days in Palestine and in Budapest.
Absolutely, and I don't want to miss what a process that could have been if we didn't have your help with this. Because we had talked, Amy and I talked, how in the world do we get this artifact from Europe all the way here? And luckily, it was a pretty smooth process. And luckily Amy was able to go pick it up. So I want to, before we take a couple questions from the audience, I want to finish on this question. Hopefully we've undermined today the power of artifacts and also the really important work that our team does on that kind of thing. Jörg, as kind of a final closer, what does it mean for St. Louis to have an artifact like this? And what can you tell our audience about that?
I think it brings history to life, and it tells you a little bit more about the people. As we learned here tonight, right? The way they came here, what brought them here, what were the motivations for coming here. And I think it's very important to keep on telling the story. As some of the survivors now are getting older, I think it's especially important to tell the story. And it's interesting to see some of these things that, like Ursula's passport, right? I mean, all those details about her. I don't know if she was very happy about all the descriptions, but it's...
Yeah, exactly. It just tells this beautiful story. And so to your point, I would encourage you all, if you haven't done this kind of work, a simple passport, a simple document can tell a million things. So we'll take a couple questions, but first, can you give a hand to our speaker tonight?
Thank you for your presentation. I want to say it looks like the Swiss have a special responsibility because of their neutrality. They can play an important role in lots of world situations. And I thank the Swiss government and the Swiss people for their efforts to help make this world a better place.
That's very sweet. You can use
In fact, most of you probably know Switzerland still represents the interests of the United States in Iran. And it did also represent the interests of the United States in Cuba until just recently, as well as the interests of Cuba in the United States. And there are still about a dozen countries that Switzerland represents their interests.
What has been done or is being done in Switzerland to tell this story about Karl Lutz?
So right now, I think most people know about it. There are books. There's the Karl Lutz Society. It has been told numerous times. There are several films. There's also some Swiss documentaries that were made about him and the work that he did.
Right before you ask that question, we're just going to use one microphone now. I will also add, as a member of the Carl Lutz Society, I can't give all the details, but there is a lot of wonderful work being done by Carl Lutz's stepdaughter, Agnes Hershey, who we heard about today. She was rescued by him, and there's some things in the works as well. So there's a lot being done to share his story.
You might have just alluded to my question, which was how can we turn this into a Steven Spielberg type movie?
I'll answer, and then you can answer. So we have had this discussion about 3 times. There is a movie that is okay. Some of you may have seen it with me. It's called Walking with the Enemy. It's kind of an independent film several years ago. It was about the actual central figure was a young Jewish man who dressed up as a Nazi officer in Budapest to rescue people. But Carl Lutz is a character in that film. So that's as close as we have. I don't know if you have anything to add to that as well.
You just said something about his stepdaughter. Did he have any biological children with his wife?
He did not. He has some nephews and great nieces and nephews who I leave mostly in New York.
Stepdaughter how did that come about?
He did. He remarried after the war. He and his first wife separate, and he married a woman who he rescued during the Holocaust, and then his stepdaughter Agnes, who's still around, was messaging me today.
Separated from his first wife.
Yeah, who was also rescued and received one of the Schutz passes. I think we could probably take maybe one more question.
More of a comment. I did not know about the Carl Lutz and how he rescued the Hungarian Jews. I will tell you, my family is Hungarian, and they were not among those who were saved by him. Many of them perished in Auschwitz at the end of 1944. But I'm really pleased to know how much Carl Lutz did to save so much of the Jewish population in Hungary.
That's very kind. All right. Well, thank you all for being here. Do you have any final words for our audience, Jörg?
Nothing.
I think that wraps it up.
I'm ready for more questions.
We'll hang out if you have more questions. All right, Helen, I think it's up to you.
Thank you. All right, so to our wonderful speakers, thank you both so very much. Can we please give them a round of applause? I would like to once again thank all of our members and guardians for your ongoing support of the museum. Because of your support, the museum is able to conserve and share stories like Carl Lutz's. As a regional hub for Holocaust education and scholarship, the preservation and presentation of these artifacts could not be more important. You are therefore not only the guardians of history, but the architects of the future of Holocaust education. Front and center of that goal is our board chair, Carol Steinberg. Thank you so much for your unwavering support of the museum. Could we please give her a round of applause? And as Amy mentioned, it truly does take a village, and especially in the world of preservation and in artifacts and exhibitions. So I once again would like to thank our Director of Archives, Amy Morman, Shannon Hess, and Rob Nelson of the Archives team, if we could give them a round of applause. To our events team for making this happen, Kelsey Jones and Cheney Jewell, our Director of Development. And she's been floating around, but I really want to thank Jana Hodder, who has been capturing everything on film for us. So we can give her a round of applause. And of course to Amy Lutz, who is truly the force behind bringing this artifact to St. Louis and continuing to tell this essential story of rescue and resilience. Thank you so much. Well done, Amy. So we do have a survey up on the screen. We are constantly looking to improve our programming. We really want to hear from you. What did you like about this evening? And always, where can we grow and where can we learn? So please, you can use your phone and take the survey. So until we meet again, be well, be safe, and good night. Thank you.